Technology and Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce will now come to order. Today, we will be holding a joint hearing entitled Disinformation Nation: Social Media's Role in Promoting Extremism and Misinformation. Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphones each time you wish to speak. Additionally, members will need to be visible on screen in order to be recognized. Due to the anticipated length of this hearing, the committee will take a 15-minute recess around 3 o'clock to provide witnesses and members a restroom break. Finally, documents for the record can be sent to Ed Kazmarsky and Joe Orlando at the email addresses we have provided to your staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. The chair will now recognize himself for 5 minutes. Our nation is drowning in disinformation driven by social media. Platforms that were once used to share photos of kids with grandparents are all too often havens of hate, harassment, and division. The way I see it, there are two faces to each of your platforms. Facebook has family and friends neighborhood, but it is right next to the one where there is a white nationalist rally every day. YouTube is a place where people share quirky videos, but down the street, anti-vaxxers, COVID deniers, QAnon supporters, and flat earthers are sharing videos. Twitter allows you to bring friends and celebrities into your home, but also Holocaust deniers, terrorists, and worse. Now, it would be one thing if every user chose where to go organically, but almost everything is scripted on social media platforms. Facebook recognizes antisocial tendencies in one user and invites them to visit the white nationalist. YouTube sees another user is interested in COVID-19 and auto starts an anti-vax video. On Twitter, a user following the trending conversation, never knowing it is driven by bots and coordinated disinformation networks run by foreign agents. Your platforms have changed how people across the planet communicate, connect, learn, and stay informed. The power of this technology is awesome and terrifying, and each of you has failed to protect your users and the world from the worst consequence of your creations. This is the first time the three of you have appeared before Congress since the deadly attack on the Capitol on January 6th. That event was not just an attack on our democracy and our electoral process, but an attack on every member of this committee and in the Congress. Many of us were on the House floor and in the Capitol when that attack occurred, and we were forced to stop our work of certifying the election and retreat to safety, some of us wearing gas masks and fearing for our lives. We fled as a mob desecrated the Capitol, the House floor, and our democratic process. People died that day, and hundreds were seriously injured. That attack and the movement that motivated it started and was nourished on your platforms. Your platform suggested groups for people to join, videos they should view, and posts they should like, driving this movement forward with terrifying speed and efficiency. FBI documents show that many of these individuals used your platforms to plan, recruit, and execute this attack. According to independent research, users on Facebook were exposed 1.1 billion times to misinformation related to the election last year alone, despite changes to your policies and claims that you removed election misinformation. Our nation is in the middle of a terrible pandemic. Nearly 550,000 Americans have lost their lives to this deadly disease, more than any other country on the planet. And an independent study found that on Facebook alone, that users across 5 countries, including the United States, were exposed to COVID disinformation an estimated 3.8 billion times, again, despite claims of fixes and reforms. And now, as the Biden administration is working to implement the American Rescue Plan and get vaccines in people's arms, we are faced with waves of disinformation on social media about the safety and efficacy of these shots. These vaccines are our best chance we have to fight this virus. And the content that your websites are still promoting, still recommending, and still sharing is one of the biggest reasons people are refusing the vaccine. And things haven't changed. My staff found content on YouTube telling people not to get vaccines and was recommended to similar videos. The same was true on Instagram, where it was not only easy to find vaccine disinformation, but platforms recommended similar posts. The same thing happened on Facebook, except they also had anti-vax groups to suggest as well. And Twitter was no different. If you go to any of these super spreader accounts that remain up despite the policies meant to curb this anti-vax content, you'll see this content. Now, understand this, you can take this content down. You can reduce the vision. You can fix this, but you choose not to. We saw your platforms remove ISIS terrorist content. We saw you tamp down on COVID misinformation at the beginning of the pandemic. And we have seen disinformation drop when you have promoted reliable news sources and removed serial disinformation super spreaders from your platform. You have the means, but time after time, you are picking engagement and profit over the health and safety of your users, our nation, and our democracy. These are serious issues, and to be honest, it seems like you all just shrug off billion-dollar fines. Your companies need to be held accountable. We need rules, regulations, technical experts in government, and audit authority of your technologies. Ours is the Committee of Jurisdiction, and we will legislate to stop this. The stakes are simply too high. The chair will now recognize Mr. Latta, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, I thank the chairman for recognizing me, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today for a conversation that's long overdue in the Energy and Commerce Committee. I'm deeply concerned by your decisions to operate your companies in a vague and biased manner, with little to no accountability, while using Section 230 as a shield for your actions and their real-world consequences. Your companies have the power to silence the President of the United States, shut off legitimate journalism in Australia, shut down legitimate scientific debate on a variety of issues, dictate which articles or websites are seen by Americans when they search the internet. When these actions are taken, users have little to no recourse to appeal the decision if they are aware of your actions. In most cases, we simply don't know. What does this mean for everyday Americans? We are all aware of big tech's ever-increasing censorship of conservative voices and their commitment to serve the radical progressive agenda by influencing a generation of children and removing, shutting down, or canceling any news, books, and even now toys that aren't considered woke. This is fundamentally un-American. At a recent hearing on disinformation and extremism online, Professor Turley, one of the nation's foremost experts on constitutional law, testified about the little brother problem, a problem which private entities do for the government, which it cannot legally do for itself. As of January of this year, Google has a greater than 92 market share in search. Facebook has over 2.7 billion monthly users, and Twitter has 187 million daily users. Your companies have enormous control over whose ideas are seen, read, or heard around the world. This gives you great power, and if misused, as we have seen in recent years, your actions have a ripple effect throughout the world that result in American voices being removed from the marketplace of ideas. While the little brother problem of censorship is frightening enough, other serious harms are occurring on these platforms that affect ordinary Americans. Young American children and teenagers are addicted to their devices and social media. This problem has been exacerbated by the pandemic and will only get worse if children continue to be separated from their peers and cannot learn from their teachers in a classroom. Your platforms are purposely designed to keep our children hooked to their screens. The use of social media has been linked to increased rates of depression, mental illness, cyberbullying, and suicide among America's youth. Illegal drugs continue to be sold online despite your previous commitments to solve these issues. Mr. Chairman, I do ask unanimous consent to submit a letter to the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy for the record. Serious
Without
problems
objection, so
persist.
ordered.
Thank you very much. Serious problems continue to persist, and I wonder how much you are truly dedicating to combating these actions. What actions are you taking to educate Americans about the dangers of using your site, especially the dangers for our kids? As ranking member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, we have oversight of any change made to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Section 230 provides you with liability protection for content moderation decisions made in good faith. Based on recent actions, however, it is clear that your definition of good faith moderation includes censoring viewpoints you disagree with and establishing faux independent appeals process that doesn't make its content moderation decision based on American principles of free expression. I find that highly concerning. I look forward to today's hearing as an important step in reconsidering the extent to which big tech deserves to retain the significant liability protection. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. The chair now recognizes Chair Schakowsky, chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to co-chair this meeting with you. I want to welcome our witnesses and thank them for coming. It is not an exaggeration to say that your companies have fundamentally and permanently transformed our very culture and our understanding of the world. Much of this is for good, but it is also true that our country, our democracy, even our understanding of what is truth has been harmed by the proliferation and dissemination of misinformation and extremism, all of which has deeply divided us. What our witnesses today need to take away from this hearing is that self-regulation has come to the end of its road, and that this democracy, this democratic, the people that you see before you, elected by the people, is preparing to move forth with legislation and regulation. The regulation that we seek should not attempt to limit constitutionally protected freedom of speech, but it must hold platforms accountable when they are used to incite violence and hatred, or, as in the case of the COVID pandemic, spread misinformation that costs thousands of lives. All three of the companies that are here today run platforms that are hotbeds of misinformation and disinformation. And despite all the promises and new policies to match, disinformation was rampant in the 2020 election, especially targeting vulnerable communities. For example, Spanish language ads run by the Trump campaign falsely accused President Biden of being endorsed by Venezuelan President Maduro. The spread of disinformation fed upon itself until it arrived at the Capitol of the United States on January 6th, which cost 5 lives. The lives lost in the insurgency were not the first cases of these platforms' failure, nor even the worst. In 2018, Facebook admitted a genocide of the Rohingya people in Myanmar was planned and executed on Facebook. 2020 saw the rise of coronavirus disinformation on Facebook platforms, including the playing of the, they called it the Plandemic. This film got 1.8 million views and 150,000 shares before it was removed. Disinformation like pandemic made people skeptical of the need for vaccines, and almost certainly cost contributed to the horrible loss of life during the pandemic. Disinformation and also hops platforms to spread viruses. I'm looking for a time. Disinformation also hops from platform to platform. Pandemic actually was first on YouTube before it was on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. Misinformation regarding the election dropped 73% across social media platforms after Twitter permanently suspended Trump, as well as also, I'm sorry? 30 seconds. Okay. And also the Capitol insurgency and QAnon. But the question really is, what took so long? The witnesses here today have demonstrated time and time again that that self-regulation has not worked. They must be held accountable for allowing disinformation and misinformation to spread. And that is why I'll be introducing the Online Consumer Protection Act, which I hope will earn bipartisan support. And thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Bilirakis, ranking member for the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you for participating in today's hearing, all the witnesses and the members. I've been thinking about this hearing since our side first requested this hearing last year. My time in Congress has provided me enough knowledge about the history of the committee to know what the Telecommunications Act was, and importantly, what it wasn't. Components of that law have been struck down by the courts, while other provisions are interpreted and applied differently than first conceived. This is all a departure from congressional intent. Regardless of what one thinks of whether all of the Communications Decency Act was the right approach, the same members that voted for Section 230 voted for that entire bill. The statute was meant to protect our society, specifically our children. To our witnesses today, here lies the problem for you. You don't want the federal government telling you what parts of your company you're allowed to operate. So imagine things from our perspective when you pick and choose what parts of the law you want to follow. I really do admire your ingenuity. You have created something truly remarkable, in my opinion. But with that power, you must also be good Samaritans, and you have an obligation to be stewards of your platform. If your legal department doesn't believe you're bound to the intent of the law, I would hope your moral compasses will. Many of my colleagues will raise legitimate concerns about the attack on the Capitol from January, and other colleagues can point to what occurred in our cities last summer. These were all incidents where social media escalated tension, incited chaos, and bred extremism through echo chambers and algorithms. As the new Republican leader, quite an honor, on the Commerce Protection and Commerce Committee, so the Consumer Protection and Commerce Committee, I have been digging into how your companies operate. That led me to run a survey of my district following our big tech hearing announcement. The conclusion is my constituents simply don't trust you anymore. With thousands of responses, over 82% say they do not trust big tech to be good stewards of their platforms or consistently enforce their policies. That includes my constituent who told me we were providing information to local families on teen suicide risks. on Facebook live stream. It was blocked by Facebook. Another constituent said she has seen countless teens be bullied online or simply not able to process a devastating comparison game that they are forced to deal with on social media. Others told me they stopped using your services altogether out of fear and distrust. One even told me they quit social media due to treatment from your companies over their family's Christian views. Each one of these represents a story of how your companies have failed people. And you'll be hearing from my colleagues with more of these stories about how big tech has lost its way, highlighting a much larger problem. People want to use your services, but they suspect your coders are designing what they think we should see and hear by keeping us online longer than ever, and all with the purpose to polarize or monetize us, disregarding any consequences for that assault, for the assault on our inherent freedoms, which we hold so dearly. So I don't want to hear about how changing your current law is going to hurt startups, because I've heard directly from them accusing you of anti-competitive tactics. None of us want to damage entrepreneurs. What I do want to hear is what you will do to bring our country back from the fringes and stop the poisonous practices that drive depression, isolation, and suicide, and instead cooperate with law enforcement to protect our citizens. Our kids are being lost while you say you will try to do better, as we've heard countless times already. We need true transparency and real change. We need, again, not empty promises from you. And we've heard that over and over again. The fear you should have coming into this hearing today isn't that you're going to get upbraided by a member of Congress. It's that our committee knows how to get things done when we come together. We can do this with you or without you, and we will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle and Schakowsky, for this very important hearing. We're here today because the spread of disinformation and extremism has been growing online, particularly on social media, where there are little to no guardrails in place to stop it. And unfortunately, this disinformation and extremism doesn't just stay online. It has real world, often dangerous and even violent consequences. And the time has come to hold online platforms accountable for their part in the rise of disinformation and extremism. According to a survey conducted by Pew earlier this month, 30% of Americans are still hesitant or simply do not want to take the COVID-19 vaccine. On January 6th, our nation's capital was violently attacked. This month, Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas identified domestic violent extremism as the greatest threat to the United States, and crimes against Asian Americans have risen by nearly 150% since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Each of these controversies and crimes have been accelerated and amplified on social media platforms through misinformation campaigns, the spread of hate speech, and the proliferation of conspiracy theories. 5 years ago, during the 2016 presidential elections, Facebook, Google, and Twitter were warned about, but simply ignored, their platform's role in spreading disinformation. And since then, the warnings have continued, but the problem has only gotten worse. Only after public outrage and pressure did these companies make inadequate attempts to appease critics and lawmakers. But despite the public rebuke, Wall Street continued to reward the company's strategies to promote misinformation and disinformation by driving their stock prices even higher. And now, despite repeated promises to seriously tackle this crisis, Facebook, Google, and Twitter instead routinely make minor changes to their policies in response to the public relations crisis of the day, and they will change some underlying internal policy that may or may not be related to the problem, but that's it. The underlying problem remains. So, Mr. Chairman, it is now painfully clear that neither the market nor public pressure will force these social media companies to take the aggressive action they need to take to eliminate disinformation and extremism from their platforms. And therefore, it's time for Congress and this committee to legislate and realign these companies' incentives. Today, our laws give these companies and their leaders a blank check to do nothing. Rather than limit the spread of disinformation, Facebook, Google, and Twitter have created business models that exploit the human's brain preference for divisive content to get Americans hooked on their platforms at the expense of the public interest. And it isn't just that social media companies are allowing disinformation to spread, it's that in many cases, they're actively amplifying and spreading it themselves. And fines, to the extent they're levied at all, have simply become the cost of doing business. The dirty truth is that they are relying on algorithms to purposely promote conspiratorial, divisive, or extremist content so that they can take more money and add dollars. And this is because the more outrageous and extremist the content, the more engagement and views these companies get from their users, and more views equals more money, Mr. Chairman. That's what it's all about, more money. It's crucial to understand that these companies aren't just mere bystanders. They're playing an active role in the meteoric rise of disinformation and extremism because they make money on it. So when a company is actually promoting this harmful content, I question whether existing liability protection should apply. Members on this committee have suggested legislative solutions and introduced bills. The committee is going to consider all these options so that we can finally align the interests of these companies with the interests of the public and hold the platforms and their CEOs accountable when they stray. That's why you're here today, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Pichai, and Mr. Dorsey. You failed to meaningfully change after your platforms played a role in fomenting insurrection, in abetting the spread of the virus, and trampling American civil liberties. And while it may be true that some bad actors will shout fire in a crowded theater by promoting harmful content, your platforms are handing them a megaphone to be heard in every theater across the country and the world. Your business model itself has become the problem, and the time for self-regulation is over. It's time we legislate to hold you accountable. That's what we're going to do. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Doyle, and Ms. Schakowsky, because I know that you're very serious about moving forward on legislation, which we will do. I promise everyone. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rodgers, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 10 years ago, when I joined big tech platforms, I thought they would be a force for good. I thought that they would help us build relationships and promote transparency in Congress. I can testify today, I was wrong. That is not what has transpired. You have broken my trust. Yes, because you failed to promote the battle of ideas and free speech. Yes, because you censor political viewpoints you disagree with. Those polarizing actions matter for democracy. But do you know what convinced me big tech is a destructive force? It's how you've abused your power to manipulate and harm our children. Your platforms are my biggest fear as a parent. I'm a mom of 3 school-aged kids, and my husband and I are fighting the big tech battles in our household every day. It's a battle for their development, a battle for their mental health, and ultimately, a battle for their safety. I've monitored your algorithms. I've monitored where your algorithms lead them. It's frightening. And I know that I'm not alone. After multiple teenage suicides in my community, I reached out to our schools and we started asking questions. What's going on with our kids? What's making them feel so alone, so empty, and in despair? And this is what I heard over and over again from parents, pediatricians, school administrators, and teachers. They're all raising the alarm about social media. A day doesn't go by that I don't talk to friends and other parents who tell me their 14-year-old is depressed. She used to love soccer. Now they can't get her to do anything. She never gets off her device or leaves her room. I think about a mom who told me she can't leave her daughter alone ever because she harms herself. For the family who's recovering after almost losing their daughter to a predator she met online. These stories are not unique to me or Eastern Washington. I recently heard of a young college student who has lost 9 friends to suicide. This is unimaginable. The science on social media is becoming clearer. Between 2011 and 2018, rates of depression, self-harm, suicides, and suicide attempts exploded among American teens. During that time, rates of teen depression increased more than 60%, with a larger increase among young girls. Between 2009 and 15, emergency room admissions for self-harm among 10 to 14-year-olds tripled, and suicide substantially increased. One study found during that time, teens who used their devices for 5 or more hours a day were 66% more likely to have at least one suicide-related outcome compared to those who use their device for just one. Other studies have found that teens who spend more time online report lower psychological well-being and more feelings of loneliness. Remember, our kids, the users, are the product. You, big tech, are not advocates for children. You exploit and profit off of them. Big tech needs to be exposed and completely transparent for what you are doing to our children, so parents like me can make informed decisions. We also expect big tech to do more to protect children because you haven't done enough. Big tech has failed to be good stewards of your platforms. I have 2 daughters and a son with a disability. Let me be clear. I do not want you defining what is true for them. I do not want their future manipulated by your algorithms. I do not want their self-worth defined by the engagement tools you built to attract their attention. I do not want them to be in danger from what you've created. I do not want their emotions and vulnerabilities taken advantage of so you can make more money and have more power. I'm sure most of my colleagues on this committee who are parents and grandparents feel the same way. Over 20 years ago, before we knew what big tech would become, Congress gave you liability protections. I want to know, why do you think you still deserve those protections today? What will it take for your business model to stop harming children? I know I speak for millions of moms when I say we need answers, and we will not rest until we get them. Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. The chair would now like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made a part of the record. I would now like to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing and thank them all for appearing today. First, we have Mark Zuckerberg, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Facebook, Sundar Pichai, Chief Executive Officer of Google, and Jack Dorsey, Chief Executive Officer of Twitter. We want to thank all 3 of you for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. Each of you will have 5 minutes to give your opening statements. Mr. Zuckerberg, we'll start with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairs Pallone, Schakowsky, and Doyle, ranking members Rodgers, Latta, and Bilirakis, and members of the committee. I'm glad that this committee is looking at all the ways that misinformation and disinformation show up in our country's discourse. There are important challenges here for our society, and we have to decide how we want to handle speech that is legal but harmful, and who should be responsible for what people say. Misinformation is not a new problem. It was 200 years ago that a congressman said that a lie would travel from Maine to Georgia while truth was still getting on his boots. And disinformation has often been spread through traditional media too. But the internet gives everyone the power to communicate, and that certainly presents unique challenges. Now, people often say things that aren't verifiably true, but that speak to their lived experiences. And I think we have to be careful restricting that. For example, if someone feels intimidated or discriminated against while voting, I believe that they should be able to share their experience, even if the election overall was fair. Now, I don't think anyone wants a world where you can only say things that private companies judge to be true, where every text message, email, video, and post has to be fact-checked before you hit send. But at the same time, we also don't want misinformation to spread that undermines confidence in vaccines, stops people from voting, or causes other harms. At Facebook, we do a lot to fight misinformation. We remove content that could lead to imminent real-world harm. We've built an unprecedented third-party fact-checking program, and if something is rated false, then we add warning labels and significantly reduce its distribution. We invest a lot in directing billions of people to authoritative information. The system isn't perfect, but it's the best approach that we've found to address misinformation in line with our country's values. It's not possible to catch every piece of harmful content without infringing on people's freedoms in a way that I don't think that we'd be comfortable with as a society. Our approach was tested in 2020 when we took extraordinary steps during an extraordinary election. We removed voting misinformation, banned hundreds of militias and conspiracy networks, including QAnon, labeled posts that prematurely or wrongly declared victory, and directed people to official results. We labeled over 180 million posts. We directed 140 million people to our official voting information center, and we helped 4.5 million people register to vote. We did our part to secure the integrity of the election. And then, on January 6th, President Trump gave a speech rejecting the results and calling on people to fight. The attack on the Capitol was an outrage, and I want to express my sympathy to all of the members, staff, and Capitol workers who had to live through this disgraceful moment in our history. And I want to express my gratitude to the Capitol Police who were on the front lines in defense of our democracy. Now, I believe that the former president should be responsible for his words, and that the people who broke the law should be responsible for their actions. So that leaves the question of the broader information ecosystem. And I can't speak for everyone else, the TV channels, radio stations, news outlets, websites, and other apps, but I can tell you what we did. Before January 6th, we worked with law enforcement to identify and address threats. During and after the attack, we provided extensive support in identifying the insurrectionists and removed posts supporting violence. We didn't catch everything, but we made our services inhospitable to those who might do harm. And when we feared that he would incite further violence, we suspended the former president's account. Now, many people are concerned that platforms can ban elected leaders. I am too. I don't think that private companies should make so many decisions like this alone. We need an accountable process, which is why we created an independent oversight board that can overrule our decisions, and we need democratically agreed rules for the internet. The reality is our country is deeply divided right now, and that isn't something that tech companies alone can fix. And we all have a part to play in helping to turn things around, and I think that starts with taking a hard look at how we got here. Now, some people say that the problem is that social networks are polarizing us, but that's not at all clear from the evidence or research. Polarization was rising in America long before social networks were even invented, and it's falling or stable in many other countries where social networks are popular. Others claim that algorithms feed us content that makes us angry because it's good for business, but that's not accurate either. I believe that the division we see today is primarily the result of a political and media environment that drives Americans apart, and we need to reckon with that if we're going to make progress. Now, I know that technology can help bring people together. We see it every day on our platforms. Facebook is successful because people have a deep desire to connect and share, not to stand apart and fight. And we believe that connectivity and togetherness are more powerful ideals than division and discord, and that technology can be part of the solution to the challenges our society is facing. And we are ready to work with you to move beyond hearings and get started on real reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. Now, Mr. Pichai, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Pichai, are you
Sorry, I have
unmuted?
my volume on. Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chairwoman Schakowsky, Ranking Member Bilirakis, Full Committee Chair Pallone, and Full Committee Ranking Member McMorris Rodgers, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. To begin, I want to express my sympathies to those who have lost loved ones to COVID or the recent gun violence in Boulder and Atlanta. In difficult times, we are reminded of what connects us as Americans, the hope that we can make things better for our families and our communities. And we at Google are committed to that work. I joined Google because I believed the internet was the best way to bring the benefits of technology to more people. Over the past 3 decades, we have seen how it's inspired the best in society by expanding knowledge, powering businesses, and providing opportunities for discovery and connection. I'm proud that anyone can turn to Google for help, whether they are looking for vaccine information, learning new skills on YouTube, or using digital tools to grow their businesses. In 2020, our products helped 2 million US businesses and publishers generate $426 billion in economic activity. We are energized by the opportunity to help people at scale and humbled by the responsibility that comes with it. Thousands of people at Google are focused on everything from cyber attacks to privacy to today's topic, misinformation. Our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Core to that is providing trustworthy content and opportunities for free expression while combating misinformation. It's a big challenge without easy answers. 500 plus hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute, and approximately 15% of Google searches each day are new to us. 18 months ago, no one had heard of COVID-19. Sadly, coronavirus was the top trending search last year. Staying ahead of new challenges to keep users safe is a top priority. We saw the importance of that on January 6th, when a mob stormed the US Capitol. Google strongly condemns these violent attacks on our democracy and mourns the lives lost. In response, we raised up authoritative sources across our products. On YouTube, we removed live streams and videos that violated our incitement to violence policies and began issuing strikes to those in violation of our presidential elections policy. We removed apps from the Play Store for inciting violence and stopped ads referencing the 2020 election or the Capitol riots as part of our sensitive events policy. We were able to act quickly because we were prepared ahead of the 2020 elections. Our reminders of how to register and vote were viewed over 2 billion times. YouTube's election results information panels have been viewed more than 8 billion times. We also work to keep campaigns safe from cyber attacks and protect platforms from abuse. After the December 8th safe harbor deadline for states to certify elections, we removed content from YouTube that alleged widespread fraud changed the outcome of the election. This past year, we've also focused on providing quality information during the pandemic. Globally, we've committed over $550 million in ad grants for COVID-related PSAs to governments, health organizations, and nonprofits. On YouTube, our COVID information panels have been viewed over 400 billion times. We also removed 850,000 videos and blocked nearly 100 million COVID-related ads throughout 2020. Across all of this work, we strive to have transparent policies and enforce them without regard to politics or point of view. Our ability to provide a range of information and viewpoints, while also being able to remove misinformation, is possible only because of legal frameworks like Section 230. It's foundational to the open web, which has been a powerful force for good for so many. I look forward to sharing more about our approach today and working together to create a path forward for the web's next 3 decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pichai. The chair now recognizes Mr. Dorsey for 5 minutes.
Thank you, members of the Energy and Commerce Committee and its subcommittees, for the opportunity to speak with the American people about how Twitter may be used to spread disinformation and our solutions. My remarks will be brief so we can move to your questions and discussion. In our discussion today, some of you might bring up specific tweets or examples, and I'll probably have an answer like, my team will follow up with you. I don't think that's useful. I'd rather us focus on principles and approaches to address these problems. I'll start with ours. We believe in free expression. We believe in free debate and conversation to find the truth. At the same time, we must balance that with our desire for our service not to be used to sow confusion, division, or destruction. This makes the freedom to moderate content critical to us. Our process to moderate content is designed to constantly evolve. We observe what's happening on our service. We work to understand the ramifications, and we use that understanding to strengthen our operations. We push ourselves to improve based on the best information we have. Much of what we're likely to discuss today are entirely new situations the world has never experienced before, and in some unique cases involve elected officials. And we believe the best way to face a big new challenge is through narrowing the problem to have the greatest impact. Disinformation is a broad concept. We needed to focus our approach on where we saw the greatest risk if we hope to have any impact at all. So we chose to focus on disinformation leading to offline harm, and 3 categories to start: manipulated media, public health, and civic integrity. Many of you will have strong opinions on how effective we are in this work. Some of you will say we're doing too much and removing free speech rights. Some of you will say we're not doing enough and end up causing more harm. Both points of view are reasonable and worth exploring. If we woke up tomorrow and decided to stop moderating content, we'd end up with a service very few people or advertisers would want to use. Ultimately, we're running a business, and a business wants to grow the number of customers it serves. Enforcing policy is a business decision. Different businesses and services will have different policies, some more liberal than others. And we believe it's critical this variety continues to exist. Forcing every business to behave the same reduces innovation and individual choice, and diminishes free marketplace ideals. If instead we woke up tomorrow and decided to ask the government to tell us what content to take down or leave up, we may end up with a service that couldn't be used to question the government. This is a reality in many countries today and is against the right of an individual. This would also have the effect of putting enormous resource requirements on businesses and services, which would further entrench only those who are able to afford it. Smaller businesses would not be able to compete, and all activity would be centralized into very few businesses. So how do we resolve these 2 viewpoints? One way is to create shared protocols. Social media has proven itself important enough to be worthy of an internet protocol, one that a company like Twitter can contribute to and compete on creating experiences people love to use. We've started work on such a protocol, which we call Blue Sky. It intends to act as a decentralized, open source social media protocol, not owned by any single company or organization. Any developer around the world can help develop it, just as any company can access its services. How does an open protocol address the concerns raised here? Greater transparency is the strongest benefit. Anyone around the world can see everything that's happening in the network, including exactly how it works. One doesn't have to trust a company, just look at the source code. Second, since the base protocol is shared, it will increase innovation around business models, recommendation algorithms, and moderation controls, which are in the hands of individuals rather than private companies. This will allow people to experiment in a market-based approach. Finally, it will allow all of us to observe, acknowledge, and address any societal issues that arise much faster. Having more eyes on the problems will lead to more impactful solutions that can be built directly into this protocol, making the network far more secure and resilient. A decentralized open source protocol for social media is our vision and work for the long term. We continue the cycle mentioned earlier of constantly improving our approach to content moderation in the short term. I hope our discussion today will focus on more enduring solutions. One final note, we are a bunch of humans with a desire to make the world around us better for everyone living today and those that come after us. We make mistakes in prioritization and in execution. We commit to being open about these and doing our best to remedy what we control. We appreciate the enormous privilege we have in building technologies to host some of the world's most important conversations. And we honor the desire to create better outcomes for everyone who interacts with them. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Well, we've concluded witness opening statements. At this time, we will move to member questions. I want to make sure that members are aware that our witnesses are being assisted by counsel, and during questions, our witnesses may briefly mute themselves to seek advice of counsel, which is permitted. Each member will have 5 minutes to start asking questions of our witnesses. I ask everyone to please adhere to that 5-minute rule, as we have many people that want to ask questions. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Gentlemen, who's speaking?
Jeff Duncan, point of order.
Yes, sir.
If the witnesses are advised by counsel and we're not swearing them in, why would they need counsel?
In previous hearings, we've always permitted witnesses to have counsel. Sometimes you'll see them at a hearing just leaning back and talking to their counsel before question. But it's allowed under our rules. And I just wanted to make members aware that they may mute themselves while that's going on.
They should be sworn in, but I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Gentlemen, my time is short, and I ask that you make your responses as brief and to the point as possible. If I ask you a yes or no question, I'm just looking for a yes or no, so please respond appropriately. I want to start by asking all three of you if your platform bears some responsibility for disseminating disinformation related to the election and the Stop the Steal movement that led to the attack on the Capitol. Just a yes or no answer. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Chairman, I think our responsibility is to build systems that can help.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I just want a yes or no answer, okay? Yes or no, do you bear some responsibility for what happened?
Congressman, our responsibility is to make sure that we build effective systems to help fight the spread of this.
Is not to answer the question. Mr. Pichai, yes or no?
We always feel a deep sense of responsibility, but I think we worked hard. This election effort was one of our most substantive efforts.
Is that a yes or a no?
Congressman, it's a complex question.
Okay, we'll move on. Mr. Dorsey.
Yes, but you also have to take into consideration a broader ecosystem. It's not just about the technology platforms we use.
Thank you. Thank you. And I agree with that. Mr. Zuckerberg, independent analysis has shown that despite all the things that Facebook did during the election, users still interacted with election misinformation roughly 1.1 billion times over the last year. The initial Stop the Steal group started on Facebook and gained over 350,000 followers in less than a day, faster than almost any other in your platform's history. And they were immediately calling for violence. In mid-December, you stopped promoting high-quality news outlets for election content at a time when the disinformation was at its height. And finally, the FBI has released numerous documents showing that many of the insurrectionists used Facebook to coordinate and plan the attack on January 6th. So my question is, how is it possible for you not to at least admit that Facebook played a central role or a leading role in facilitating the recruitment, planning, and execution of the attack on the Capitol?
Chairman, my point is that I think that the responsibility here lies with the people who took the actions to break the law and do the insurrection, and secondarily, also the people who spread that content, including the president, but others as well, with repeated rhetoric over time, saying that the election was rigged and encouraging people to organize. I think that those people bear the primary responsibility as well, and that was the point that I was making.
I understand that, but your platforms supercharged that. You took a thing and magnified in 12 hours. You got 350,000 people in your site. You gin this up. Your algorithms make it possible to supercharge these kinds of opinions. I think we're here because of what these platforms enable, how your choices, put our lives and our democracy at risk. And many of us just find it just unacceptable. I want to ask each of you another question. Do you think vaccines that have been approved for COVID-19 work? Just yes or no. Do you think the vaccines that have been approved work? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Yes.
Mr. Pichai.
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Dorsey.
Yes, but I don't think we're here to discuss our own personal opinions.
I just want to know if you think the vaccines work. Yes?
Yes, however.
Thank you. Okay, so if you think the vaccines work, why have your companies allowed accounts that repeatedly offend your vaccine disinformation policies to remain up? I mean, according to report, just 12 accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram account for 65% of all the vaccine disinformation on your platforms. You're exposing tens of millions of users to this every day. I don't have the stats on YouTube, but my understanding is it's similar. So my question is, Why in the midst of a global pandemic that has killed over 500,000 Americans that you haven't taken these accounts down that are responsible for the preponderance of vaccine disinformation on your platforms? Will you all commit to taking these platforms down today, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congressman, yes, we do have a policy against allowing.
Oh, I know you have a
vaccine
policy, but will
disinformation.
you take the sites down today? You still have 12 people up on your site doing this. Will you take them down?
Congressman, I would need to look at and have our team look at the exact examples to make sure
Look
they
at it
violate
today
the policies,
and
but we
get
have a
back to
policy
us
in place for
tomorrow
this.
because those still exist. We found them as early as last night. Mr. Pichai, how about you?
We have removed over 850,000 videos in
If you remove
2020
them
on
all, do you
COVID.
still have people that are spreading disinformation on your platforms? There's about 12 super spreaders.
We have clear policies and we take down content. Some of the content is allowed if it's people's personal experiences, but we definitely
Okay, thank you. Mr.
widespread.
Dorsey, I see my time is getting expired. Mr. Dorsey, will you take these sites down? You got
Yes.
about 12 super spreaders. Will you take them down?
Yes, we remove everything against our policy.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. I will now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Latta, for his 5 minutes.
I thank my friend for yielding. Amanda Todd was just 15 years old when she hung herself. Amanda met a man online who took inappropriate screenshots of Amanda and proceeded to follow her around the internet and harass her for years. He found her classmates on Facebook, and he would send them the picture he took of her. To cope with the anxiety, Amanda turned to drugs and alcohol, but it came too much for her. Mr. Zuckerberg, clearly, Ms. Todd was underage, so the photo that was shared to harass her was illegal. Do you believe that Facebook bears any responsibility for the role it played in her death, yes or no?
Sorry, I was muted. Congressman, it's a incredibly sad story, and I think that we certainly have a responsibility to make sure that we're building systems that can fight and remove this kind of harmful content. And in the case of child exploitation content, we've been building systems for a long time that use AI, and we have thousands of people working on being able to identify this content and remove it. And I think our systems are generally pretty effective at this. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that we keep improving them.
My time's pretty short, but would you say yes or no then?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Well, in the question, yes or no, then any responsibility?
Congressman, I believe that the responsibility of
Okay,
platforms.
well, let me move on because I've got very short on time. Do you believe that Facebook should be held accountable for any role in her death? Yes or no?
Congressman, the responsibility that I think platforms should have is to build effective systems to moderate this content.
I'm going to have to take that just not responding to the question. Unfortunately, stories like Amanda Todd's are only becoming more common. While we often talk about how your platforms can be used for good or evil, the evil seems to persevere. Mr. Zuckerberg, you've publicly stated that you support thoughtful changes to Section 230 to ensure that tech companies are held accountable for certain actions that happen on their platforms, such as child exploitation. What specific changes do you support in Section 230?
Thanks, Congressman. I would support two specific changes, especially for large platforms. Although I want to call out that I think for smaller platforms, I think we need to be careful about any changes that we make that remove their immunity, because that could hurt competition. So let me just call on these for larger platforms. I think first, platforms should have to issue transparency reports that state the prevalence of content across all different categories of harmful content, everything from child exploitation to terrorism to incitement of violence to intellectual property violations to pornography, whatever the different harms are. And
well, let me ask
also,
you quick now, where those transparency reports be reported to, and how often do you think those should be going out?
well, Congressman, as a model, Facebook has been doing something to this effect for every quarter, right, where we report on the prevalence of each category of harmful content and how effective our systems are at identifying that content and removing it in advance. And I think the company should be held accountable for having effective systems to do that broadly. The second change that I would propose is creating accountability for the large platforms to have effective systems in place to moderate and remove clearly illegal content. So things like sex trafficking or child exploitation or terrorist content. And I think it would be reasonable to condition immunity for the larger platforms on having a generally effective system in place to moderate clearly illegal types of content.
Let me interrupt real quick because I'm running really short on time, because I know in your testimony you're talking about that you say that platforms should not be held liable if a particular piece of content evades its detection. So again, that's one of the areas when you're talking about the transparency and also the accountability I'd like to follow up on. I have to go on real quick. Mr. Pichai, yes or no, do you agree with Mr. Zuckerberg's changes to Section 230?
There are definitely good proposals around transparency and accountability, which I've seen in various legislative proposals as well, which I think are important principles, and we would certainly welcome legislative approaches in that area.
Okay, Mr. Dorsey, do you agree with Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no? On the changes on 230?
I think the ideas around transparency are good. I think it's going to be very hard to determine what's a large platform and a small platform, and it may incentivize the wrong things.
Okay, gentlemen's time has expired.
Thank you very much. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Chair Schakowsky, Chair of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Mr. Zuckerberg, immediately after the Capitol insurgency, Sheryl Sandberg did an interview in which she insisted that the siege was largely planned on smaller platforms, but court filings actually show something quite the opposite, that the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers used Facebook to coordinate in real time during the siege. And so my question for you is, will you admit today that Facebook groups in particular played a role